Virtually everyone knows about the United States Civil War, one that tore the nation apart from 1861 until 1865. But few people know that in the summer of 1862, an entirely different war was raging on the frontier of Minnesota. Over a terrifying 5-week span, the Dakota tribe, angered by broken treaties with the United States government, would lay waste to vast swaths of the territory in one of the most violent conflicts in American history. This war, known as the U.S.-Dakota War, would result in hundreds of lives lost on both sides and, ultimately, in the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And it all began with a fearsome battle on the banks of the Minnesota River. Tonight, join history at the OK Corral for the Battle of Redwood Ferry. Southern Minnesota, August 18, 1862. As the fast-moving current of the Minnesota River threatens to sweep him and his men downstream, Captain John Marsh of the 15th Minnesota Infantry does his best to direct his men across the river to the opposite bank. As the men struggle against the current, many of them repeatedly losing their footing, the air around them is filled with bullets, arrows, and war cries from the Dakota warriors that pursue them. Many of these soldiers are young men, some still teenagers, and they are rightly terrified at the hellacious attack that now surrounds them. Many of their fellow soldiers have been cut down already, and many more wounded lie strewn about the riverbank, desperately pleading with their comrades not to leave them. These unfortunate men are soon cut down where they lay, as Dakota warriors swarm the area, dozens of them seemingly appearing out of nowhere. To the American soldiers, it seems that hell itself has been unleashed upon them. And to Captain Marsh, it seems that he has led his men into the inferno. Only hours earlier, at around 10 in the morning, he and his men had been on the grounds of Fort Ridgely, when word had reached them that there had been an attack on the nearby headquarters of the Lower Sioux Agency. J.C. Dickinson, the manager of the agency's boarding house, had arrived at the fort after a harrowing trip from the agency in a buckboard wagon, carrying himself and his young family. He had reported to Captain Marsh that the Dakota, a subculture belonging to the mighty Sioux tribe, were laying waste to the agency and to the surrounding settlements, already having killed several soldiers and settlers. Soon after Dickinson and his family hurry into the fort, more settlers appear outside of the gate, begging for shelter and protection from the attacks. By 10:30 a.m., Captain Marsh had assembled a force of 47 men and marched out of the relative safety of the fort towards the site of the agency. As they proceeded towards the site of the attacks, they were met by dozens of frightened and wounded settlers, all of them fleeing towards Fort Ridgely, and all of them warning the soldiers not to proceed any further, as an ambush would likely already be set for them at the Redwood Ferry crossing. However, seeing the utter devastation being wrought upon his fellow Americans, Captain Marsh had been insistent that he and his men were adequately prepared to meet any threat. Thus, undeterred, he had ushered his men forward through the untold destruction that had been left in the wake of the recent Dakota raiding. As they approached the site of the ferry, the only available means of safely crossing the turbulent river, they encountered several burned-out homesteads of local settlers. With every passing mile, his men had, understandably, become increasingly unsure of their captain's insistence on moving towards what looked like a virtually unavoidable ambush. But still, Marsh had remained unmoved and ordered his men onward. As they neared the ferry, a number of wagons from Fort Ridgely had managed to catch up to them, and Marsh, himself mounted on a mule, had ordered his foot-bound men into the wagons in order to reach the ferry sooner. This seemed to many of his men as though this was simply a means of hastening their own demise. But with nothing in the way of recourse, they had dutifully loaded into the wagons and ridden off towards the river. Unfortunately, the premonitions of the soldiers would soon be proven correct. About a mile away from the river, they had been hurriedly unloaded by the increasingly unnerved wagon teamsters, who themselves seemed rapidly unsure of Captain Marsh's logic, as an attack from the Dakota seemed more and more imminent, especially at the site of the river crossing. However, after dismounting the wagons, Marsh had simply ordered his men to again assemble and continue their march forward. His intention had been for his men to board the ferry, then to cross and proceed onwards towards the site of the Lower Sioux Agency in order to quell the uprising. But Marsh's insistence that there would be no contact with the Dakota warriors until they neared the agency had proven to be a grave miscalculation. After being dropped off by the wagons, he and his men had proceeded across a small creek and, after a brief rest, had proceeded on towards the site of the Redwood Ferry. In a grisly harbinger of the events to come, they found the body of the operator of the ferry, headless and mutilated, only a few dozen yards from the small building which served as the ferry's headquarters. For any young soldier stationed in Minnesota, the thought of a roving band of Dakota warriors is, perhaps, the most terrifying thing they can imagine. The Dakota are the easternmost of the three divisions of the Sioux people, who inhabit Minnesota, northern Iowa, and eastern South Dakota. Unlike their western counterparts in the Nakota and the Lakota, the Dakota have adopted a partially agricultural lifestyle. Though they still depend heavily on hunting and gathering, they also farm crops of what is known to tribes throughout North America as the Three Sisters, in beans, squash, and corn. The Dakota's dependence on their crops is, in fact, a driving factor behind today's attacks. In the Mendota Treaty of 1851, the Dakota had agreed to implement more anglicized farming practices employing tools, techniques, and training provided by the Lower Sioux Agency. But in recent years, the availability of seeds, tools, and cash for crops has slowed considerably. This resulted in the Dakota relying even more heavily on hunting. But they also found hunting to be made nearly impossible by the terms of the 1851 treaty, which relegated them to hunting grounds consisting of only a small strip stretching along the Minnesota River. Unable to yield sufficient crops or to hunt for their own meat, the tribe had been left almost solely reliant upon rationing from the U.S. government. And in the early 1860s, especially after the advent of the Civil War, the dispensation of rations was often drastically delayed or canceled outright. This storm of violence now being wrought upon the soldiers and settlers of southern Minnesota is a direct result of the Dakota's recent treatment. The Dakota have been greatly angered, as had been evidenced to Captain Marsh's men with the gory sight of the ferry pilot's corpse. And as the soldiers had walked past, many of them had worried if they would soon meet a similar fate. And in the end, many would be correct. As they arrived at the Minnesota River, an eerie stillness seemed to linger in the air. The banks of the river were covered in thick weeds and brush, making it nearly impossible to spot any movements from either shore. To add to the unsettling nature of the situation, the ferry boat itself sits untouched in the water, tethered to its usual location. This, to be sure, is a nearly inexplicable oversight considering the Dakota have lain waste to so many homesteads and settlers already. Why, many of the soldiers wonder, would their means of transport across the river be left unbothered? However, Captain Marsh continues to insist that this location holds no discernible danger, and thus he orders his men to take their positions as the ferry is made ready to transport them to the opposite bank. But suddenly, before the soldiers are able to load into the ferry, a Dakota chief appears on the western bank of the river. By many accounts, this is said to be the much respected and well-liked chief named White Dog. His body is painted red, and he holds the reins of his horse in one hand and a gleaming tomahawk in the other. However, despite his fearsome appearance, the chief signals to Marsh's interpreter, a local guide named Peter Quinn, with overtures of peace. From across the river, Quinn asks the chief why he, a man who is relatively well known to all of them as a peaceable individual, appears to be dressed and ready for war. The chief insists that he has brought his tomahawk merely to smoke with the army's representatives and to parley for an end to the violence. It is not wholly uncommon for the Plains tribes to hollow out the handle of a tomahawk in order to use it to smoke their tobacco. And while Captain Marsh now feels a growing, unshakable suspicion, he and Quinn agree to the chief's terms and begin to move towards the ferry. But before they can even reach the crossing site, one of Marsh's men cries out that he has spotted a Dakota warrior hidden in the reeds and brush along the riverbank on this side of the river. In a matter of only a few seconds, another cry goes out, and then another. Now, dozens of Dakota warriors can be seen swarming the banks, moving directly towards the soldiers. It seems that the negotiations for peace had only been a ruse in order to buy the warriors more time to get into position. And now, it was far too late for the soldiers to escape. In only a matter of moments, it had seemed to Captain Marsh and his men that the world had exploded into a fury of war cries and gunshots. Arrows began to whiz in amongst them, sending several soldiers crumbling to the ground, killed or grievously wounded. Marsh orders his men to return fire and make ready to retreat back to the road which they had come in on. But, to their horror, their retreat was also cut off by the horde of Dakota warriors. Now, they are trapped. Marsh then ordered his men to make a break for the cover of a small thicket behind them, the only immediate area that is not flush with Dakota warriors. As more and more of their comrades fall dead and wounded around them, the soldiers follow Marsh to the thicket and then down the bank of the river. The thicket was dense enough that the Dakota attack had been unable to reach them, but it would only be a matter of minutes, at best, before the thicket ended and the Dakota would be upon them again. Captain Marsh had surveyed their rapidly devolving situation and seen only one terrifying option as their only hope for retreat. In order to make their escape and attempt to make it back to Fort Ridgely, they would have to cross the fast-moving river. And thus, Captain Marsh, a confident swimmer, had led his men into the water, where they now fight to somehow keep their heads above water and simultaneously avoid the Dakota's constant fire. Marsh exhorts them to struggle on to the opposite bank, while himself dodging projectiles that slam into the water all around him. But suddenly, his head disappears under the water. Then he reappears, apparently in great distress. The swift current has swept him under. Two of his men move to save him, attempting to grab him without being swept away themselves. But within seconds, he disappears for a second time. His men will never see him again. But despite the loss of their captain, the men remaining in the river, surrounded by Dakota warriors intent on killing them, must now struggle on to cross. And what is undoubtedly a horrifying scene for all of them, several more of their party, one by one, are swept away by the river's current, all of them never to be seen again. Of the 47 soldiers that had marched out of the fort on this morning, now only 23 remain as they throw themselves onto the south bank of the river and make desperate scrambles into the nearby woods. In fact, the chaos has separated the men into two groups who have lost contact with each other. Every man among them is now fervently aware that they have only escaped for the moment, and that they are now all unarmed and stranded in the middle of enemy territory. Now, they must make their way back to Fort Ridgely, or they will all surely perish. In the face of this, it is 19-year-old Sergeant John F. Bishop who takes the lead of his group of survivors totaling 15 men, 5 of whom are grievously wounded. With the ever-present threat of another Dakota ambush, they cautiously make their way back to the fort, only arriving well after nightfall. The next day, the second group of 8 infantrymen would make their way into the fort, with several severely wounded soldiers among them. The 24th survivor, the badly wounded William Sutherland, would only make his way to the fort on August 20th after a harrowing 2-day trek alone through the wilderness. The fort itself is now bereft of a large number of its officers and soldiers whom they had depended on for defense. Now, it seems to many within the fort that all they can do is sit and wait for the next Dakota attack. And the next attack will certainly come. The events of August 18th will be known to history as the Battle of Redwood Ferry, and it would be the first battle in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. This war, often overlooked in the shadow of the simultaneously occurring Civil War, will bear witness to some of the most brutal fighting ever seen on the American frontier. Over the course of the next 5 weeks, over 500 soldiers and settlers would be killed, along with hundreds of Dakota. In fact, by the time the last of the survivors had reached Fort Ridgely, the next attack was already taking place as another contingent of warriors attacked the nearby town of New Ulm, Minnesota. Though the settlers and soldiers present would drive them off after a hard fight, the Dakota would return again only days later to wreak havoc on the small settlement. On August 20th, the same day that William Sutherland had crawled through the gates after his harrowing one-man escape, the Dakota would attack Fort Ridgely itself. Though the small Dakota force would be driven off, only 2 days after this, they would return again with a far larger and far more organized force. The raiding would not stop until mid-September of 1862, when the vast majority of the Dakota warriors were either driven west to the lands of their Sioux cousins or forced to surrender to the army. Over 300 of these warriors would be tried by hastily assembled military tribunals and summarily sentenced to death by hanging. These sentences would be reviewed by then-sitting President Abraham Lincoln, and while Lincoln would pardon the vast majority of those condemned, he would sign off on the execution of 39 Dakota warriors. In the end, one additional warrior would be pardoned, leaving 38 to face the gallows on December 26, 1862. These hangings, the largest mass execution in American history, would be not only the final act of violence in the U.S.-Dakota War, but a turning point for Native tribes on the Northern Plains. The government's hopes of creating a large-scale spectacle that would discourage regional uprisings once and for all would ultimately backfire significantly. The act would only redouble the resolve of the Dakota and other tribes to fight on until the bitter end. After December 26, 1862, their willingness to cooperate or negotiate with the United States government would be greatly diminished for decades to come. In many respects, the many battles of the short but unimaginably intense U.S.-Dakota War would spell the beginning of the end for the tribes of the Sioux Nation, though the war with the U.S. Army would continue for many years to come. But the many tales of the unbelievably brutal, violent battles of the U.S.-Dakota War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you like this story, be sure to click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the History at the OK Corral newsletter. Link is in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.